Both of us had mothers who were deeply abusive, so we shared a bond around our maternal abuse. And
I'm McMillan, and I'm here doing trauma talk and looking at intergenerational trauma. And today I'm joined by an amazing young woman named Kristen. And first of all, thanks very much for being here. I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk to you. If it's okay with you, we're going to kind of start this process by taking a little bit of a walk down memory lane, or a step back in time, so to speak, and just kind of talk a little bit about kind of your relationship with your grandparents. And I know that you've had some issues with alienation with your parents, but if we can go back one more generation, tell me about your relationship with your grandparents.
okay, so on my paternal side, my grandmother Margaret Lewis and my grandfather Galen Lewis. Galen died before I was born. He was a decorated naval intelligence officer with the U.S. Navy who served in the Pacific Theater in World War II. And he died pretty young when my father was 19. My father was the oldest of four boys. So the grandfather died when his oldest was 19. And he was, after he came back from the war, he served in the IRS. And he grew up in Arkansas, but then moved to Washington, D.C. when he was young. My paternal grandmother, Margaret Lewis, grew up on a farm in Indiana and then also moved to Washington, D.C. during the war, where she worked and then and met Galen. And she died when I was 3. So I didn't know those two that well. My other grandparents on the maternal side are John, colloquially known as Jack Rudy, who served in the U.S. Army during World War II, and then came back, and then relatively later in life, like in his late 30s, because of the GI Bill, was able to go to university and get his PhD, and then he worked as a professor of Middle Eastern studies at Georgetown for his life. And then my grandmother, and John Rudy grew up in Oakland from a pretty poor family, Oakland, California, and then also moved to Washington, D.C., where he got the job at Georgetown. My maternal grandmother, Nancy Rudy, is still alive and kicking in Bethesda, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. She was born in Arkansas, and then her mother took all of the kids after their father disappeared during the Great Depression to Chicago, and then eventually to Los Angeles, which is where my grandmother grew up. And she is still alive and very well in her 90s and causing troubles in a nursing home, which she periodically leaves when she feels she's fine. So those are my grandparents.
So that's very interesting. I didn't realize your whole kind of second generation back is from the States. Were your parents born in the States, or are they born in Canada?
They were, my mother was born in California, in Berkeley, when my grandfather was going to school there, and my father was born in Washington, D.C. And I was also born just in a sort of countryside suburb of Washington, D.C. before my parents moved to Canada.
Interesting. So how old were you when they moved to Canada?
A little over a year old. Just
Okay.
walk.
And do you have brothers and sisters?
I have a sister who is 3 years younger than me from my mother and father, and then I have a half sister who is 14 years younger from my father and his second wife, and had a step sibling on either side.
Okay. And are you currently involved? You're currently dating? Are you loving life being single? What's your situation?
I am not inside a marriage-like relationship at the moment.
Fair
Yes.
enough.
I was in a
Uh,
marriage-like relationship for 8 years, which concluded 5 years ago.
Fair enough. And was there a reason why it concluded? Like, can you tell me a little bit about what you learned about your ex and maybe their relationship with their parents or grandparents?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, preserving his dignity is important to me, and we remain on friendly terms, and I honor him deeply. I mean, we shared 8 years of our lives together, and I have a great deal of honor and respect for him. Both of us had mothers who were deeply abusive, so we shared a bond around our maternal abuse, and I learned a lot about myself in that relationship, and about what it means to be just recreating patterns from childhood with one's intimate partner.
Yeah, it's amazing how those trauma bonds develop, and how they can be such almost like a magnetic attraction between people who are in the dating scene. You start to kind of realize that you have a lot of shared experiences, and you bond based on those shared experiences, which is arguably not the best thing to do to kind of attract the same kinds of negative experiences. But I suppose on some level, misery loves company, and I think it happens very frequently. So it's certainly no slight against you or your ex for bonding on that. Was it physical abuse? Was it emotional abuse, psychological abuse that you went through, or that he went through, that kind of you related to each other on?
I would say deep psychological abuse was the primary, but not the only form of abuse.
Okay. And you guys were living together for a while?
Yeah, we lived together for 8 years.
Okay. And how was the dynamic as you map that out over time? Did you go through the typical kind of honeymoon phase? Was it the proverbial 7-year itch that kind of led to the demise of the relationship, or was there something more significant that happened?
It was a very atypical relationship, so I wouldn't say it followed the usual patterns, really at all. We were both intensely loyal to each other. He was much older. He's 26 years older than me. And for me, like, loyalty is paramount. So my dedication to him and my desire to be loyal to him were extreme, even to the point of like enabling both of us to be in a situation that wasn't good for both of us eventually. So no, I wouldn't say it was the 7-year itch thing. I think it was something a bit different like that. I feel that ultimately neither of us could face what we needed to face in terms of the childhood trauma stuff, as long as we were still attached together.
Interesting. I'm 16
Hard to
years.
say. I mean, when you look in the rear view mirror, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to kind of analyze in retrospect. And I do believe in people staying together whenever possible, but there comes a point when if you feel that you're impeding the other person's growth or allowing them to stay stuck in a habit that keeps them weakened, that though it's painful and might go against your ideals, sometimes you have to leave. And that was the situation. Yeah.
I'm 16 years older than my partner. And my ex-partner her parents were also 16 years difference in age. And I understand there's certainly some some challenges to that. Not that age needs to be a barrier for people to be in a relationship with each other, but certainly there was some growing pains in my ex's parents' relationships because of that age difference, and not so much with mine. I think once you hit this kind of sweet spot, maybe in between 25 and 50, you seem to be able to get on quite well with the other person as a mature adult.
Yeah, I would say the age factor was not a factor. Yeah, at all.
So was there any kind of specific incident that led to the break of the relationship?
It was just the slow tolerance of a bunch of things that weren't workable, that just built up over time. Yeah.
How were you I don't mean to pry, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but like, how was your communication? Were you connecting authentically, or was it, towards the end, was it more superficial?
What I would say is true for myself is that I was, not because even of how he is necessarily, but I was fearful because of my intimate patterns laid down in childhood, where I was just terrified of him, not because he was scary, but because I was scared, scared of creating a conflict, or scared of not being the thing that he wanted me to be all the time. And then I was also in a caretaking role for a long time, because he had some fairly challenging physical as well as mental health issues. And so I didn't want to rock the boat or hurt him. But my desire not to hurt him left me not being able to stand up for some things that were actually necessary for me to be strong enough to do my service in the world. So I was, I'm naturally submissive in a relationship and like to be, but I was overly submissive to the point of compromising on points of integrity for myself that would have helped me, but I also failed to correct him in areas that would have helped him to not persist in certain patterns. So I feel that I was artificially weakened due to still just fearful patterns that were projections of my childhood experience.
It's interesting. I recently watched a workshop with, I think you're familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate, out of Vancouver, and he was presenting in Los Angeles, which is obviously a much warmer climate than where he's from, and talks about being up in northern BC, which is where you're not in northern BC, but obviously you're familiar with northern BC, and how cold it gets up there. He said he was talking about adaptive behaviors, and how in our childhood, when we are going through trauma, we learn these adaptive behaviors to protect ourselves. And sometimes as we get older, we don't learn to shed those adaptive behaviors, and they become a part of our personality. And the analogy that he said was, in northern BC in the wintertime, it gets down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, really cold. So your adaptive behavior is, you have to put on layers. You have to put on a shirt, you have to put on a sweater, you have to put on a jacket, gloves, hat, neck warmer, boots, the whole 9 yards, in order to survive. That's your adaptive behavior in order to survive. But if you went down to LA and you didn't realize that you had to take all that stuff off, which is effectively the adaptive behavior, you would die. So your adaptive behaviors that keep you alive in some scenarios will actually kill you in other scenarios, or not necessarily kill you, but have a detrimental effect on the relationship. So I thought that was a really interesting analogy. Just kind of reminded me of what you just said. So, I mean, it seems like you, there wasn't necessarily a specific tipping point for the relationship, but you stayed in the relationship for a time. Did you do that because of kind of a duty to him, or was it not an option to split off earlier, or was it? Um, Tell me a little bit about why you stayed in as long as you did.
Well, we both deeply cared for each other, and we were both generous with our love and care for each other. So it was, I don't think either of us was in it for ourselves, so to speak. We weren't like trying to maximize our pleasure or anything like that. And yeah, there was no sense in which I mean, I'm happy to leave any situation regardless. I don't sort of wait for some sort of strategically opportune time to leave. We didn't have children, so there was nothing like that. It's just for a long time, I just wanted to be loyal and to not hurt him no matter what. And for a few years, he really was, it was, and I don't want to blame him either. It was also how I was. I was a certain way that I wasn't able to correct until I had time on my own, till I could heal and like face the childhood issues that, so I don't feel that I was, even though I was thinking I was being good for him and being a good caretaker and loyal. I do believe that loyalty only happens when you're able to be loyal to the truth. And I wasn't able to be loyal to the truth until I'd cleared up like deep patterns of conditioning from my childhood. And that simply took time and solitude and work. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
understood.
what I would say. So yeah, so I said like when I really, yeah, it was deeply painful to have to leave him and for him to suffer the way he did. And yeah, we've worked over the years to heal that separation in terms of being able to maintain friendship and to like as extended family members. But it's yeah, so that's why I say it's a bit atypical. But I don't think that how I was when I was in the relationship was good for him. So I needed to correct myself till I felt like I could be good for somebody while still being also good for myself.
That's fair. You mentioned before we got on the podcast that you recently reconnected with your dad after some time. Were you alienated from your dad?
My mother and father, my mother left my father when I was 6, and they had due to my mother's high conflict personality style, a lengthy, protracted set of legal battles. That the last one happened when I was in my early 20s, where she sued for a bunch of back payments on child support. And I would see him every other weekend, but the context was one in which she demonized him and would tell me that he had sexually abused me, which is not true, and just would claim that he had physically abused her and tell people that that was the reason for the marriage breakdown, and otherwise just make the condition of living in her house, and she had full custody, be that I wasn't allowed to admit to liking my father. And then she further, I have certain physical attributes that are similar to my father, as well as certain parts of my personality. So any parts of my personality or anything about me that was like him, she would attack, like so often. So you're just like your father would be the typical kind of thing. So I was also then used as the fall guy, and subject to various accusations growing up. due to being like him. So I was sort of treated like this potential perpetrator all the time due to being just like my father, while at the same time told not to care for him. So it created a rift in the relationship with him, but I would still see him every other weekend and on holidays and so on. But it created a situation where I felt duplicitous, because I felt like in order to be loyal to her, I had to be disloyal to him. And that has not been good. And then finally, in my early 20s, I cut off contact from her so that there was no more any basis for her receiving any money from him. Because as long as I was in university, she was getting extortionist levels of child support from him. So I actually quit my master's program so that she would no longer be allowed to get any money from him, because that was the only thing that I could see following her final court settlement as possible. And then it's been a slow time over the years for me to learn to trust him. Not that he did anything to not earn the trust, but my view of him was poisoned. And then also for me to, it sounds religious, but almost atone for the guilt of feelings that I'd betrayed him so deeply by being loyal to her. Well, in a way, like survival sort of depended on being loyal to her because she had custody and she was the one who fed me. But I've learned to, over time, build the relationship with him, show him that he's honored, regain his trust too. And then, he was here visiting a couple of weeks ago and we had an excellent time. And he's, I feel that he is finally, after 20 years, able to trust me and for us to have the right kind of relationship again. And for me to also accept him as a loving authority in my life that I want to have involved in things that he really ought to have been involved in the first place. So it's taken some untangling, but it's pretty good now. Yeah.
Well, that's I'm sure you can see me smiling, and I don't know if the camera will have shown me smiling, but I certainly was while you were talking. It warms my heart to hear that, and I think it takes a level of emotional maturity. If I can just kind of skip back to the Gabor Mate analogy that we were talking about, like it seems like you've kind of taken off your coat and headed down to California, so to speak, and shed that defense mechanism from your childhood, and that's allowed you to kind of create a conducive relationship with your dad. So really happy to hear that, and I'm glad for you, for sure.
Thank you.
Do you and again, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, do you feel that the not necessarily the alienation, because I know you saw your dad regularly, not 50-50, but do you feel like that like the discussion about your dad and him being portrayed as someone villainous, I suppose, for lack of a better description, did that lead you to I suppose connecting with older men as somewhat of a replacement for a paternal figure in your life?
That's a good question. One would think that, looking at it from the outside. My former husband-like figure, David, who was 26 years older, that was the only, significantly older man that I've connected with. And I would say, if anything, our relationship was more me being like his mother and him being like my son, in spite of the age difference. So and he was a remains huge, looks like a big biker. So he looks like a tough big biker, and I have tended to look younger than I am. So it seemed like tough big biker with this young girl, and we got a lot of judgment for that, which was funny because he's actually deeply soft and kind. And if anything, I'm more inclined to be the asshole in the situation. Not really, like I aspire to be kind, but so I think if anything, I haven't looked for a daddy enough. And now I'm finally free to have that be something that I actively welcome in my relationships. So I think I subconsciously didn't have enough loving authority and actually didn't seek that out when I should have. So I tended to have, relationships where there was a lot of caretaking on my part, which I knew how to do well because I took a lot growing up, and didn't necessarily put myself in positions of vulnerability where the person was more powerful and could take care of me.
So you're the oldest child. Did I get that correctly?
Oh, yes, very much
Yeah.
so.
So you're very much going to be almost thrust into a caretaking role with siblings and step siblings and half siblings as well, if I'm correct.
And my mother was very infantile. So most of my childhood was spent in a household with my mother and my sister. And my mother and my sister are very emotional. And I just had the sense they were people I needed to take care of. So I developed a sort of paternalistic approach to them, even when I was young, which wasn't always very effective, but that's what my comfort zone was being kind of a caretaker with strong logical capacities to cut through the overly emotional females in my life.
Fair enough. Are you and again, this is not intended to be a personal question because we live on other sides of the country and we work together professionally, but like, are you approaching, like, how are you approaching recoupling? Is it something you're interested in? Are you searching for a relationship? Are you dating, or are you just happy to be solo? What's your current situation?
I am making sure that I am rigorously clear and rigorously like free of tics from childhood, so that when I connect with somebody, I'm not like bringing in a bunch of shit to their table inadvertently. That's my position. Yeah.
That's fair.
And I do have somebody that I'm quite interested in, but I realize that I need to be clear in myself before something of that magnitude can proceed. So I'm cleaning house. Yeah. And I did have one relationship in the last 5 years since my marriage, which was good, but not a sort of partnership track situation. Yeah.
Got it. This has been kind of an enlightening discussion. Is there anything else that you, I guess, you want to share that I haven't asked you about, or I guess for the people who ultimately will be watching this, is there anything kind of about your story that you want them to take away from it?
I think what I've noticed in myself is there are certain like deep emotional patterns that create a false sense of security, even when they seem insecure, that have tended to perpetuate the trauma. So here's an example. My grandmother on my mother's side, her father left the family during the Great Depression, leaving my great grandmother alone with 5 kids in Arkansas, having to fend for herself, being really proud. It's the Great Depression, not wanting to like take help from anybody and just plow on ahead. And then some of the family narrative is she's a strong single woman, but there's also like this deep wound of abandonment in this absent man, not knowing, where he went. It was very common during the Great Depression for men to disappear for a variety of reasons, just suicide or feeling incapable of providing for the family for no fault of their own, just the economic circumstances or anything, just, getting murdered, riding the trains, you don't really know, anything can happen. So his absence, then I feel haunted my grandmother, but then also my mother had, I would say, a deep fear of abandonment. So it's sort of like the terror that the man is going to leave has been a bit of a kind of haunting that I've worked with. And because my mother did remarry eventually my mother and my father both remarried. So there was a man in the house who was my mother's husband, my stepfather. So she wasn't really alone, but she was always emotionally needy and turning to me for support. So like, for me, female neediness is disgusting. So I've tended to reject it in myself. And then I've also had this fear of abandonment because just my mother's just this chaotic thing because of the abandonment. So I've had to just let go of both the fear of being needy, because I realize it's possible to have needs without being a narcissistic monster that tries to take everything from everybody. So it's sort of like rebalancing myself. So I'm no longer afraid of being like my mother, but I'm also no longer unconsciously having this fear of abandonment that I think is intergenerational. So I guess there's things like that about working with one's emotional state that are interesting, that it's like, yeah, it's the no longer living in the North and you're in California, you can, and even if somebody does leave, you're not in rural Arkansas in the Great Depression in a terrible state. It's actually like, you can recover from somebody not wanting to be in a relationship, and it's not Hiroshima. So
That's true.
yeah.
I admire you because you are not only self-aware, but you're introspective, and you're not in a rush to kind of hurry back into a situation for the sake of companionship, I suppose. And I think it takes a very intellectually intelligent person to enjoy their own company until such time as it's the right time to share your company with somebody else.
Yeah, I like the idea of joining around strength. And then I think the relationship can be an excellent context for intergenerational trauma to heal, unless it becomes just a kind of container where everything gets confused and mixed up, and then it can get people stuck for forever. So I don't buy the narrative that you have to be perfectly healed to be in a relationship, and I don't impose that standard on myself either, but it's just making sure that the crap doesn't carry forward into the next situation. So I am rigorously committed to clarity, but also not to self-perfection. And I don't expect perfection in others, because that would be like wishing to be a unicorn. I wouldn't even want that.
Well, if and when you decide to kind of pursue your next relationship, I absolutely agree with you that, you know, a great relationship can be one where you don't amplify your trauma, you heal from your trauma. And I wish you nothing but the best, and I hope you're able to find that person who helps you heal and take the next steps and move forward.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. This was really great to talk about this. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll send this to you for approval before posting.
Great. Thanks so much, Gavin. Thanks for this work.